Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Good morning, Your Excellency, Governor, Director General, Senator, Commissioners, former governors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour and a great pleasure to be here this morning. Nigeria faces some challenging near-term macroeconomic conditions. Despite these, I'm positive about the outlook. I believe that Nigeria has a massive opportunity to play a leadership role not only within Africa, but to be able to position itself globally as well. This morning, I'm going to look at Nigeria from a global, a regional, and a national perspective, and talk about what that means, in my view, for the economy, for infrastructure, and for pension funds. But let's take the global picture. The key issue, indeed the key issue for any economy, is how to position itself in a changing and what I think will still be a growing global economy. There is considerable uncertainty globally at the moment. This is highlighted by volatility in financial markets, a slump in commodity markets, anxiety over equity prices, the questions as to whether we have a bond market bubble, and now repatriation of funds from emerging economies. In recent years, markets across the globe have really benefited from a combination of three things: cheap money in the West, the feeling that the world economy was still doing well because of the strength of China, and then on top of that, certainty and clarity about policy and the feeling that there would be no policy shocks because policymakers were outlining clearly what would happen. Then, hey presto, in recent months, all that has changed. The focus is on the Fed tightening. China is facing a significant and sharp slowdown, and having been there recently, the talk is of a new normal, albeit a temporary new normal. And then on top of that, in recent weeks, we've seen the Chinese devalue and the Fed lacking clarity about the outlook for rates, and the certainty about policy has gone. The result has been greater uncertainty, more volatility, a desire by investors everywhere to search for yield or for growth opportunities, and the worry that markets have not been pricing for risk, so that risk premiums have started to rise, particularly impacting emerging economies. It's in this environment and in this context that we need to view Nigeria. Nigeria needs to weather this difficult external short-term environment. But at the same time, it's an opportunity for Nigeria to position itself in what I think will still, despite what's happening globally, be a pretty strong global outlook over the next 10 to 20 years. It's often said there are three types of economists: those who can count and those who can't count. So I'll keep numbers to a minimum. But let me quote three figures: 32, 62, 82. The Director General did point out that not everyone is sharing in economic success. GDP per head is not growing as much as it could across the globe. Yet, there is no doubt that the global economic cake has continued and will still continue to grow. The size of the world economy at the beginning of this century was $32 trillion in size. The size of the world economy the evening Lehman Brothers went bust and this financial crisis started was $62 trillion. And by next year, according to the IMF's growth forecast, the world economy in size will be up to $82 trillion. So despite the challenges, despite the pessimism, despite the caution, the global cake has got bigger. Indeed, oil prices, which in August, September hit a 6-year low, that clearly has impacted oil exporters. But the International Energy Agency points out that this year, global oil demand will be at a 5-year high. Perhaps oil prices will not remain low forever. So it's a more complex environment than many economists and commentators would have you believe. Yes, there is a slowdown. Yes, China is slowing. China, though, will cut rates to probably 0. But at the same time, the underlying trend points to economic and financial power shifting from the west to the east, emerging economies accounting for more of global activity next year than ever before. Soft power and the importance of brands, and hence brands like PEMCOM become more important. Hard power is changing, and institutional power is changing. What then does the region of Africa need to do? In terms of future growth stories, I think the key issue is that Africa will continue to globalize at a rapid pace. This always threatens a pushback by policymakers because change brings with it sometimes losers as well as winners. But I think the key thing is to embrace change and to position for the future. There are many examples of globalization helping Africa. Mobile technology is often cited as the most likely and most typical example of globalization. But at the same time, being based in London and probably spending 3 or 4 months of the year traveling, I can tell you that another aspect of globalization is that across the globe, international investors are now less able to turn a blind eye towards Africa. And the more that Africa delivers on growth and on returns, the more international investors will have to put more of their funds into Africa. I believe that Pan-Africanism will become a more common future term, capturing the mood of the time. There are big challenges. Youth unemployment is high. Jobs need to be created. In the summer, the African Development Bank's latest economic outlook talked about the African working population over the next 15 years rising by 435 million, a huge increase. At the same time, there are issues such as intra-regional trade being quite low. When I worked on the Africa Commission in the early 2000s, it was clear that intra-regional trade needed to increase. As services, as domestic demand grows, and as cities become more important drivers of growth, that will happen, provided transport infrastructure is put in place. But in a nutshell, I think that Nigeria already is showing a regional lead in West Africa and has the potential to play a bigger lead across the whole continent as a whole. But there is a paradox. While for some international investors, their perception of Africa is still negative, driven by a legacy of the past, at the same time, many investors already putting money into Africa and who are optimistic about Africa are not patient enough, discounting too much good news too soon. So we have those who are cautious and we have those who know but want all the success and returns now. That creates a paradox, but also creates an opportunity. What then of the domestic national challenge facing Nigeria? There are many ways of looking at this, but again, let me use the international criteria in terms of how the rest of the world often views Nigeria. And ahead of coming to Nigeria, I spoke to some big investors and asked them to give me their views of Nigeria, just to make sure I was capturing all the mood of the moment. What we know is that there is unease about corruption. What we also know is there's concern about the security situation. But what we also know is that the administration is very focused, full on tackling both of those. At the same time, and what should give confidence, is not only the administration's clear plans to address these, but when I look across the globe, you're not the first country to face these challenges. I used to travel frequently to Indonesia. One would have said at the time, and some indeed did, say that corruption was endemic. Corruption is no longer a concern for most people when they go to Indonesia. Security. I remember at one of the IMF meetings spending a dinner with the former president of Colombia. Gosh, you could not have thought of a more difficult place security-wise to go. But he talked about the importance of a clear vision and enacting it in that security situation.